You've likely heard what's going on in Europe these days, at least some of them. I already mentioned that since 2015, Europe has changed in a huge way in the first year. Between 2015 and 2016, I think they actually extended it to maybe March of 2016. 1 million refugees arrived in Germany. Germany has a population of 80 million. That's more than double the population of Canada. And in 1 year, 14 months, Germany increased in population by 1 million people. I tell people that's like starting Winnipeg in 1 year. Just poof! Even bigger than Winnipeg, because Winnipeg is not 1 million people. Is that going to have an effect on the country? You can bet on it. And it has had an effect. Some of you may have heard that there's been some tremendous pushback. Angela Merkel, who is the Chancellor, she has gone through a rocky ride. And it could very well be, as a matter of fact, I just heard that she announced that she will not run again. But do you know that she was the daughter of an evangelical pastor? I don't know whether she's a believer, committed believer or not. I don't know. Some of my colleagues in Germany feel she is, although she has to be guarded in how she says it. But I do know that when she became aware of those people landing in Germany, and we saw the stories of what happened. Remember that little boy who they got him off of the sun on the beach, and who had died because he with his family had been thrust into the sea, and he didn't live. Angela Merkel said, "We've got to do something." And that opened the floodgates. And people still today accuse her of, "You shouldn't have said that." Well, it was her heart. She said, "We've got to do something about these people. They're hurting. We've got to do something." Well, that changed Europe. It has changed Europe. It's still going on. The CDC doesn't talk about it anymore, but people are still landing in Europe. They're not coming across to Greece anymore. They're actually taking a more dangerous route than the people who were crossing from Turkey into Greece. That was only 11 kilometers of water that they had to cross. Now they have to cross much greater, crossing from northern Africa, Libya, and some of those places, and going right across the Mediterranean, which can be a very dangerous, rocky ride. And they're coming into Italy and Malta and Spain and places like that. They're coming in now. Now, it's true, there's a lot fewer coming now than there used to be. And the whole thing has changed now. They used to come on just little, whatever they could find to float, they would come across on. And now what they're doing is they're coming on ships. But what happens is they get these boats and they pack them. And of course, these people are profiting, the owners are profiting from these people coming because they have to pay, $1,000 or whatever it is to get on this boat to come. And they pack them in there. And then if that boat capsizes, then there's 200 or 300 people, lives that are lost. So it's really a dangerous kind of thing. And but the people are still coming. It's changing the face of Europe. Some of you likely have just noticed recently, France, bless her heart, is back in the news again. Rioting going on, even last night again, rioting going on, people upset. By the way, I just tell you, we lived in France, we love France, we love it, it's part of our heart. The French have a different way of expressing themselves than we do. Canadians, we're so reserved, we're so quiet. And so, if Randy wants to find out how some of you feel, he almost has to get you down in an arm wrestle and hold you on to say, how do you feel about this? Because we're so reserved in the way. Well, the French are much more expressive. So they get out on the streets and they'll march and they'll say, well, I'm against this and I'm against that, and that's what's happening right now. Everybody's It's just flooded over, and you get the right-wingers and the left-wingers, and they're all out together, and they actually hate each other, but they're all out marching side by side because they say, we're just frustrated with life. And I look at that and I say, this is not catching God by surprise. This is not catching God by surprise. There have been people praying and praying and praying for years and years for Europe. Because Europe, at one point, was the place in which we look back on our heritage. That's where the gospel message was proclaimed around the world. It's a wonderful heritage. I look back on the heritage that I have, and I know your heritage, for the most part, is based back in Europe, and we thank God for that. Because it was because of Europeans that the gospel was spread around the world. Unfortunately, the Europeans themselves, because of all kinds of reasons that we could actually spend a lot of time talking about what those reasons are, they walked away from the church. And they walked away from God. Actually, it's quite an example, a sobering example for Canadians. Because it would appear in a number of ways that we're going down the same road. And so Europe today is far away from God. But they are not satisfied in what they are involved in. And that's coming through. They need Jesus. They really do. I know that's a cliche, but they need Jesus. And that's the wonderful message that we have at Christmas that we have already sung about, these wonderful songs that emphasize Jesus bringing peace because it touches the heart. And he transforms the heart. And that begins to be expressed in a society when people's hearts are transformed. So Europe is in a state of hardness, but God is opening their hearts. The economic situation is not good in Europe. There's a lot of social issues, by the way. One of the things that really has stirred what's going on in France right now is because, just like here in Canada, in order for us now to deal with global warming and everything that's going on, they're starting to introduce more tax. And what was the straw that broke the camel's back in this latest thing that's going on is the president decided he was going to raise the price of diesel fuel. And that seems to be the thing that sparked it all. But actually, I really feel like I've watched some videos and everything of what's going on there. That's just the spark that started it. But the Kindle was ready to go. It was just like in California. Everything was hot. Just somebody threw a match down and poof, away it goes. And that's what's going on. People, they're just not satisfied. They have been told that materialism, you make more money and it's going to make you so peaceful and so happy. And it's not working. And that's why people are frustrated. Now, it expresses itself in a number of different ways, but that's what's happening. And I believe it's a consequence of prayer. People praying, oh God, it seems that Europe is so hard. Nobody seems to want to listen. I remember when we were there, we would want to talk to them about Jesus, but we found that many people, our generation, had such a big chip on their shoulder about the church. I mean, it was so abusive, and it's irrelevant, and all kinds of things that they would tell us. And we would have to listen to them as they went through and spewed all that out. Because they were convinced, and it bothered them. And they had to get it off their chest before we could ever say, now could we just talk about Jesus in the Bible? Who he is? What did he do on earth? Let's just take the church and place it over there for the moment, okay? And let's just talk about Jesus and take another look at him. But many of our generation had a real hard time doing that. But I want to tell you today, God's at work. He's at work. He's using immigrants. He's using the fact that our generation had such a chip on their shoulder, they didn't want to go to church. No way. And so now their kids are growing up. Jesus? Who's Jesus? They never heard of Jesus. They don't do it in school. You never talk about Jesus in school. And the parents, they never talk about him. So now you can talk to them about Jesus. Oh yeah, I think I've heard of that guy. They've never heard the stories. They have no chip on their shoulder because they've never had any exposure to him. And so that's why we say that Europe has moved from being post-Christian, which means you're reacting to Christianity, to a little bit more pre-Christian. It's almost like going to a tribe that have never heard about the Bible and Jesus. And I look at that and say, you know what? God's always at work. So now we have the opportunity of actually sharing with people who have a bit of an interest. Oh, that's interesting. But the scene has changed in Europe. And now what it is, because Christianity is kind of over to the side. Now, let me say, you go to France, you drive along, and you'll still see the cathedrals. I mean, they don't tear those things down. But if you go and try to get in them, they're locked, and many of them are closed, or they're coffee shops, or different things like that, because nobody's going anymore. So those kinds of things still exist, and they're over there. But now there's maybe more of an interest. But what's happened now is Christianity is part of the smorgasbord that you're going to taste. Because now it's Hinduism, Islam, and New Age, and all kinds of things. And they all have value. And so I'll taste a little bit of that, and you may say, you know what, I tasted that, and that was really good. It really helped me feel better. Oh, well, that's good. Yeah, maybe I'll try it sometime. You know what? I've been taken from this one, and it's been really good for me. And we make our own spirituality. And that's the kind of thinking that's over there now. Well, it's a little bit different for us. How do we share the good news in that particular context? But it still is important for us to share the good news. Because we're convinced that that's the good news they need to hear. Jesus is actually the only way. And maybe that will give you a pleasure for a moment. But Jesus is the one who will touch your heart and transform your heart. So we have that still, the same gospel message, but our approach is going to be a little different. Now I'd like us to go to 2 Corinthians chapter 4. That was a long introduction, but actually I'm way in my message, okay? I just want you to know that because you may be thinking about whether the turkey will be burnt by the time you get home. I'd just like us to note a few things about 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Maybe just a little bit about the book. 2 Corinthians is, of course, the second book Paul wrote to the Corinthians that's in our Bible. Actually, many people feel it was likely the third letter that he wrote. But it was one in which he writes because people were criticizing him as not being a legitimate apostle. Now, he wasn't one of the 12, He wasn't one of the 12 disciples. And so after a period of time, you're going to have some people criticize him, and they're going to say, listen, you're not legitimate because you're not one of the 12. And you'll see this in this book. Every once in a while he say, oh, this is ridiculous that I have to defend myself as I am defending myself. But this book is really a defense of his ministry. And what he does, and I thank God that he actually guided Paul to write this book, because what he does in this book is he exposes himself. He opens up his heart and shares with the people some of the challenges that he deals with in ministry. And yet in the midst of it, he has a proper perspective. And it's that perspective that helps us as believers. Because there's many times, I don't know about you, but with me, that I get discouraged. And that was the case in France. I remember as I was getting ready to come back for my first furlough, I guess that was it 1990, coming back on our first furlough. I'd been over there, studied French. Well, I had a little bit of Saskatchewan French, but it wasn't enough to get me along. And I learned French, and I was ready to plunge in. Now, I had heard that it's difficult ministering in France spiritually. And I can remember, and then I hit the reality of what it was like. I was coming back, and I was going to come to a place like Gladstone, and I was going to share about ministry in France, and I felt like I had really nothing positive to share. Because it seemed like nobody wanted it. Nobody cared. And you rationalize and you try to explain yourself. But this is what Paul is doing in this book. He just shares his heart. And he talks about some of the things that he experiences as a person who wants to share Jesus with others, like we all should be involved in. And one of the things that he really shared about is that there seemed to be opposition from the people when he would talk to them about Jesus. Have you experienced that? I have. And so this passage is really important for us. Because Paul, we can identify with Paul. We read this and you think, oh, hey, he wrote that for me. Because Paul gives us a perspective that's so important. And this is a perspective of whether you're in Gladstone or whether you're in Paris, France, living as a believer. This is an important message for us all. So let's just take a second. I just have a few thoughts that I'd like to share on this. I'd like to read the passage again. I have the New International Version. You may have other versions. Let's read verses 1 to 6. Therefore, since through God's mercy we have this ministry. By the way, if you want to find out what this ministry is that he's talking about, you have to read chapters 1 to 3. But in essence, what he's saying is, God has given me a new mandate. It's based on the good news that Jesus has now come and he has redeemed the world. He is ready to respond to those who respond to him and transform their lives. He says, that's the ministry I have. I am like an ambassador giving the good news, and I'm ready to do that. But then he uses this phrase. He says, we do not lose heart. Now you know, that's a cue. You know he's going to talk about reasons why he is tempted to lose heart. So let's read on. Rather, we have renounced secret and shameful ways. We do not use deception, and we do not distort the word of God. Now, why would you use deception and distortion? Well, it's kind of like the story that I've heard about a guy who was the manager, the advertising manager for the Fido dog food company. And so he had all of his sales representatives there, and it's a rally, okay? So he's really trying to get them riled up and get them going and everything like that. And he says, who's got the best packaging in the whole dog food industry? We do, because they had just improved on that. Who's got the best advertising? We do, because they had just worked on their advertising. And he went on in a number of different factors. And then he said, well, why are we 10 in the top 10 in terms of sales? And one guy piped up in the back and said, because dogs don't like it. That's the bottom line, isn't it? You're not going to sell it if dogs don't like it. And isn't that the temptation sometimes? It doesn't seem like people are listening and accepting the gospel, so let's change the gospel. Or let's be a little deceptive and not kind of give it all to them until they get in the door, and then we say, oh, by the way, there was something we didn't tell you. Paul says we don't do that. That's not the way to do it. And I must admit, I've been tempted to do that. You know, it just seems like people in France just didn't seem to listen. They weren't interested. And so you begin to think, well, maybe I should just kind of change it a little bit. No, I'm not talking about changing your approach. I think you need to learn to change. Sometimes we need to adapt how we talk to people. But I don't think Paul is saying, no, we don't do that. So what's he say we do? Okay? On the contrary, by setting forth the truth plainly, we commend ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God. Do you know what he's saying? And it's so very true. He's saying, what is so important for us is to live out the truth in our lives. Has God changed your life? Does God mean something to you? Well, live and reflect God in your life, so that when you tell them the good news of the gospel, it corresponds with the way you are living. And so, at least you're not deceiving them. You're not saying, hey, buy this. Well, do you ever use it? No, never use it in my life. They're not going to buy it. Does it make any difference in your life? And are you living it before you're giving it? And then he goes on to say, verse 3, this is really key. And even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. The God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbeliever, so that they cannot see the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. You know what? That can be a really discouraging 2 verses, but I find it really encouraging. Because you know what it's telling me? It's telling me that the issue that we're dealing with is that there is the enemy of our souls that's at work here. And he is veiling, he is blinding people to understand and appreciate the message. And it made me realize that those people in France of our generation, they've got such a chip on their shoulder, he's blinded them to the gospel. And in this day and age in which we're living in France right now, it's a big smorgasbord, and the idea is one idea is as good as another, so just pick and choose and adapt it for your own use. That's another blinding that he's working with. He's convincing people in certain ways that they do not need to respond to the good news of Jesus Christ. He's at work. That's his role. That's what he wants to do. Oh boy, that's discouraging. Because I'm no greater than Satan, than the devil. And if we were just on our own, let's just pack it up and go home. Notice the next verse. Man, this helps the perspective. Well, he goes on to say in verse 5, for we do not preach ourselves, but who do we preach? Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Christ's sake, for Jesus' sake. And then he says this, for God who said, let light shine out of darkness, he has made his light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ. And what I find that Paul is emphasizing here is, take heart. We don't lose heart, because God's at work. And what he does is he turns on the light. He turns on the light. But he wants you to be servants of people for the sake of Jesus. And as you are servants in the sake of Jesus, trusting him, praying, trusting that as you engage people in people's lives, the light comes on. Because God turns on the light. And we are in step with what God is doing. And he turns, and people come and respond to him. When I read this and really started to think about it, it just helped me with perspective. And I realized that some places God is doing amazing revival, wonderful things. And Christians and missionaries go and they're involved there, and they should be, because there's a harvest. They should be involved in the harvest. But I should not be comparing myself to them. Because God called me to a part of the place where I had to just to work with a soil that seemed hard. But trusting that God, as I got involved in people's lives, and I was faithful sharing the good news of Jesus with them, that God would turn on lights. And then what happens is, from time to time, God will bring a mighty change in a group of people. And I think in Europe right now, we are on the forefront of seeing some real changes happen. We are seeing some of these new refugees because churches in Germany are starting to say, oh, I think God has actually made this happen right before us, because he wants us to respond to these people. We don't have to go to the Middle East to actually do it with these people, although there still is a need for some people to go to the Middle East. But he's brought many of them here. And can we open our doors? Can we go and help and teach them German? Can we help them with all of the paperwork that needs to happen so that they can become citizens in Germany? Can we befriend them and help them to understand how to live in Germany? And as churches are responding to that, they're finding that some of these people, not all of them, some of these people are responding to Jesus. And as they do, they become great evangelists to their own people. So we're starting to see God work through the whole refugee situation. And it's changing things. Churches in Germany are starting to pick up on this and say, you know what? This is a glorious opportunity, not a tragedy. Now that doesn't mean that the government may and maybe should decide we're not going to have any more for a while because this is just too much. That's up to the government to decide. And we ought to pray that governments have wisdom in those kinds of things. But it's opportunities that God is giving. And I believe we're going to see that because of the refugee situation, God's going to bring Europe back to himself. Because it's actually having quite an influence on the German population. I've had some of our missionaries say that when they start ministering to refugees, and they would hold German classes and different kinds of things, they've now had people who've lived close around them who would never ever talk to them because they know they're Christians, one of these radical Christians that actually live it. And they stay away from them normally, but now they see they're responding to the refugees, and they're knocking on their doors and saying, you know, can we help you? Wow, that's a marvelous opportunity. So some of the German population are actually joining in with the Christians to teach German and do things like that. And in the process, German Christians are having the opportunity of speaking into German people's lives who before this would never want to join together. It's amazing what God does, isn't it? God's got a plan. God's got a mission. And he's going to do his mission. I want to say this to you. I don't know where you are. Sometimes I believe that Christians have basically said, don't ask me to share about the good news with Jesus anymore. I've done it and people have laughed in my face and they've done this and they've done that, and that's for Randy and some of the other guys that are old enough. others to do, and not me. I'm out. I want to encourage you. God's still in the process of turning on the lights. And you know what? He wants to do it with people that are around you. So he wants you involved. And he wants you to be faithful, praying, asking God for opportunities, and then being sensitive to what God might be doing in the lives of people around you, and being willing to talk about what God has done for you and what God can do for them. That's the message that I believe is important for whether you're ministering in Europe or you're ministering in Canada. God has called us to a great task. He's given us a great ministry, but it's based on what he's already done in our lives. And Randy explained it well up here. What God has done for us. We were doomed, and he changed our lives. And we have the opportunity and the obligation to share that with others as well. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I know I'd like to go a little bit beyond here, but you people are so encouraging. You just get a guy fired up here. I just thank you so very much. If you'd like to talk to us about ministry in Europe, I'd be delighted to do it. But may the Lord bless you, and especially as we come into Christmas time. This is a time when people's hearts tend to be more open to the good news of Jesus. Because even in some of the stores, we hear the Christmas carols. And I have no doubt some kids are going to be asking their parents, what's that all about? I heard this. What's it all about? This is an opportunity to share the good news of Jesus with people around us. God bless you.